and so Glab Kerr is going to be here soon.
A sixth year Egyptology student here at Brown. He graduated from Oxford in 2014, and he worked at the Czech Institute of Egyptology in Prague in fall of 2018. So without further ado, Federico.
Thank you very much. And as the only Brown presenter, let me welcome everybody to our university. So in my paper today, I'm gonna discuss the town of Kumidi, present-day el-Loz in Lebanon, which became an administrative center of the Egyptian Empire in Syria-Palestine during the New Kingdom, and we know that it was the seat of an official called Rabû, Great One, often translated as Magnate in the translations. And we do also have a small archive of Akkadian cuneiform tablets, which are roughly contemporary with the reign of Akhenaten. Maybe some of them may come from the reign of Amenhotep III, so contemporary with the Amarna archive. And both Kumidi and the whole Rebekah Valley played a prominent role in the interregional contacts and the trade, starting already during the Middle Bronze Age, and especially during the Late Bronze Age. And the Rebekah, as you can see from this map, was a nexus of crucial importance between the northern and the southern Levant, because it was sheltered by the Lebanon mountains to the west, the Anti-Lebanon and Mount Hermon to the east. But it also had like a series of clefts and valleys that allowed communication between the Rebekah, the Mediterranean coast, Philistia to the south, and the Syrian plains to the north, and also climatically it had a more Mediterranean climate than other parts of Syria, with enough precipitation for rain-dependent farming, and also there was availability of water, because el-Loz especially was very close to both, the three valleys of the Jordan, the Litani, and the Orontes. And the site was excavated first by Rolf Ackman from the University of Saarland. Then there was 3 years of occupation by the Israel Defense Forces during the invasion of Lebanon, and excavations resumed in 1997 by Marlis Heinz from the University of Freiburg. And Kumidi el-Loz yielded a wealth of foreign material culture, and interestingly we have plenty of objects from Egypt, Palestine, Cyprus, and Mycenaean Greece. But Syrian and Anatolian objects are scarce, and Mesopotamian objects are completely absent. And what is very interesting is that there is an unequivocal connection of some sort between the elites of Kumidi and Egypt, because we have a lot of Egyptian objects from the area known as the Shatz House, the treasury, located east of the palace, which served as a burial place for the members of the elite, almost exclusively children, with the exception of one adult. And as Alexander was explaining, it's very problematic to make conclusions about the type of contact that this material culture indicates, but it does indicate the variety of material culture that the site of Kumidi could appropriate during this period. And as Marlis Heinz, the excavator, pointed out, Kumidi's importance lay in its position in the demand and supply chain during the Late Bronze Age. So now back to philology. We have only one attestation of Kumidi in the Egyptian record of the 18th dynasty. And this happens in 2 copies of the so-called Megiddo list of Thutmose III at Karnak, written in a slightly odd manner, because normally it's never written with a K sign but with a Q. And we do have a scarab from the Schatzhaus of Kumidi, as you can see, inscribed with the name of Thutmose III, which seems to be contemporary with the archaeological context. So there was certainly a connection between Egypt at the time of Thutmose III and Kumidi. But when and how the town became part of the Egyptian sphere of influence cannot be ascertained, and Rolf Ackman linked the destruction layers of Palace P6 at Kumidi to the first campaign of Thutmose III, but this mention of Kumidi in the Egyptian, in the topographical list from Karnak, cannot substantiate any historical reconstruction of the events, and it doesn't prove that the Thutmose III attacked Kumidi. So what I personally believe is that a more promising approach is to chart the occurrence of toponyms corresponding to or located in the Rebekah Valley in the Egyptian sources of the 18th dynasty. And if you look at the biography of Amenemhab from Thebes, it reports military activity in the region of Takshi, and Takshi could indicate the northern part of the Rebekah Valley or the territory immediately to the north. And this happens after a battle at Karkemish, the crossing of the Euphrates, a battle somewhere in the Orontes Valley, and the sack of Kadesh. So it seems quite clear that Thutmose III would have entered the Rebekah, if ever, from the north, after campaigning in Mitannian territory in northern Syria, and eventually turning southwards into the Orontes Valley. And why Kumidi is not mentioned at all in the narrative of Thutmose III demands explanation. And these battles in the region of Takshi are followed by the elephant hunt at Ni, corresponding to Apamea, on the Orontes, so the campaign turned northwards after Takshi. Maybe one possible suggestion I was thinking is that Kumidi might have already accepted pharaonic hegemony, and it was not necessary for Thutmose III to go to Kumidi himself, but this is just an idea. If we move to the reign of Amenhotep II, the Amada stela and its duplicate at Elephantine reports a campaign in Takshi in the third regnal year, in which the king defeats 7 local rulers from Takshi. 6 of them are hanged in Thebes, and 1 is sent to Nubia to be hanged in Napata. But the description of the events is vague, and there is also a possibility that this campaign might have happened during the co-regency between Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. And if you look at the Memphis stela, we have an unclear passage with the mention of villages of Minjat, and it has been suggested that the villages of Minjat might indicate a territory in or close to the Rebekah, but this designation is unclear. And Takshi, which may correspond to the northern Rebekah, is attested on several topographical lists of the New Kingdom, 2 of which dating to the 18th dynasty, and 1 is the list of toponyms on the chariot of Thutmose IV from his tomb, and 1 is list BN of Amenhotep III at Komel Hetan. So the more precise toponym used to designate the Rebekah Valley and probably the region of Kumidi, which might be Amku, is completely absent from the historical and military narratives of the 18th dynasty and occurs only once in the Megiddo list of Thutmose III. So, in light of the Egyptian evidence, it is possible to claim that Thutmose III and Amenhotep II campaigned near, but not at Kumidi. And it seems that the preferable way to enter the Rebekah was from the north, where the Orontes River created a larger and more suitable entrance for an army, as opposed to the narrower passes upstream the Litani or the Jordan. And this way, the Egyptian army could also have received food and supplies in the coastal ports before facing the Hurrian populated territories in the Syrian plains. And also it's worth bearing in mind that Kadesh is located close to Kumidi, immediately to the north, and Kadesh was an enemy of the Egyptian kings for most of its history. when we move to the Amarna letters, Kumidi is attested on 6 Amarna letters, which do not offer much insight into the politics of the city. And a ruler of Kumidi is mentioned is mentioned as the subject with the Egyptian king in EA 198. And its broken name, as you can see, has been interpreted in different ways. Arahatu by Knutsson, Arasha or Arali by Moran, Arata by John Unegard, and Arawana by Akman. Evidence for Kumidi's strategic importance may be found in Amarna letter 197, in which Biryawaza of Damascus reports a pro-Hittite rebellion in Syria and claims to be guarding Kumidi from where he would presumably lead a pro-Egyptian, anti-Hittite counteroffensive. And the role of, as I said, Kumidi served as the seat of an Egyptian administrative official. And the way we know about this is because an Egyptian official in residence is mentioned in 9 Amarna letters, and we have the name of at least one such official, Puhuru, variously spelled, and Puhuru is a clear cuneiform rendering of Egyptian Paher, the Syrian. And if we trace the attestations of the Egyptian official, we may get a sense of the role that Kumidi played in the geopolitics of the region. And the first of this letter is very fragmentary, and Puhuru is mentioned twice together with other political actors such as Akidzi of Katna, the king of Barga, some troops, the city of Tunip, and a certain Shumita who might have been an Egyptian agent. In the second letter, Pihura, another version of another spelling of Puhuru, is mentioned in combination with another official, Yanhamu, and the passage implies that the Puhuru and Yanhamu would have been capable of repulsing the pressure of the Apiru tribes or outlaws if the Egyptian king is not capable of sending troops. The third letter is from Ribhadda of Byblos to the Egyptian king, and Pahura is accused of acting against Byblos by sending Sutians, and we don't really understand who these Sutians are. It seems like a local tribe of nomads and troublemakers, but we don't really know. The fourth letter is another letter from Ribhadda of Byblos to the Egyptian king, and it repeats the same accusation against Pihura in a more detailed manner, and Pihura's misbehavior is said to jeopardize the very security of Ribhadda and Byblos, and 3 men are said to have been abducted from Byblos, and they were presumably citizens of Byblos, but we know nothing about them. Then in the fifth letter, Ribhadda of Byblos is concerned over the permanence of Pihura in Kumidi because the absence of Pihura would cause the death of all the mayors of the pharaoh. Mayors is Azanu in Akkadian, which is a rendering of Egyptian Hati Ab. The sixth letter is from Aitakama of Kadesh, and Aitakama accuses Birawadza of Damascus of defamation, desertion, and of attacking his realm. And quite interestingly, Puhuru appears to be the pharaonic official to whom Aitakama reports his activities and proves his loyalty to Egypt. And we know from other Amarna letters that Aitakama was not loyal to Egypt at all. The seventh letter from Amarna is broken and was probably sent by the Egyptian chancellery, and the addressee is instructed to guard the Rabû of Kumidi, Puhuri, and a series of cities are mentioned, 2 of which are most certainly Kadesh and Kumidi. The eighth letter is fragmentary and the sender's name is not preserved, but it is interesting because Puhur is said to be responsible for the protection of the pharaoh's cities and is accused of failing to do so. And finally, our last letter from Amarna, which mentions Puhuru, the sender's name is not preserved, and Puhuru seems once again responsible for the protection of the Egyptian vassal cities in the region. So in light of this overview, EA 132 is the only secure connection between Puhuru and Kumidi. And the permanence of Puhuru in Kumidi seems to be essential to the security of the local Egyptian mayors in Syria. And as for his official title, Puhuru is designated as a Great One, Rabû, only in 2 letters, EA 189 and EA 190. But if taken all together, these 9 letters do offer some insight into Puhuru's role within the Egyptian administration in Syria. And he clearly appears to have monitored and to have been responsible for the security of those cities and territories within the Egyptian sphere of influence. And his lack of protection or absence from Kumidi could result in the loss of these dominions to the Apiru outlaws. And Puhuru could be approached by the local rulers, and they use a preposition anamuhi in Akkadian. And Puhuru could act as an intermediary between the local rulers and the pharaonic court. And it is to Puhuru that in Amarna letter 189, Aitakam of Kadesh claims to have reported his activities and professed his loyalty to Egypt. So this role as an intermediary may account for his knowledge of the socio-political situation as implied by the unknown sender of Amarna letter 208. And interestingly enough, 4 of these 9 letters belong to the Ribhada dossier, which suggests that the authority of Puhuru was recognized in Byblos as well. And this evidence contradicts Rolf Hackmann's claim that the Egyptian official in Sumur on the coast was responsible for coastal Syria and Kumidi controlled inland Syria, because we know that we have evidence for Ribhada reporting to interacting with the Rabû of Kumidi. So Puhuru appears to have been an Egyptian official with a complex set of functions, and his role extended beyond the Bekaa Valley, and he could intervene more or less directly in the affairs of important cities such as Byblos on the Mediterranean coast. Now we look at some indigenous evidence, and there's a total of 9 cuneiform texts in Akkadian from Kumidi. 7 of these, 1 through 7, have been excavated in the late Bronze Age palace P4, which was probably built during the reign of Thutmose III, rebuilt several times, and it was destroyed and plundered sometime during the reign of Akhenaten, and it was not clear by who and in what context. Texts 8 and 9 come from the antiquities market, but for a variety of reasons, it's pretty certain that they come from Kumidi, and I'll briefly talk about them later. And text 1 and 2 are copies of the exact same text, addressed to 2 different local rulers, Zalaya of Damascus and Abdinilki of Shazaina, respectively, and we don't know where Shazaina was. And text 1 is almost intact and preserves a brief message sent by the Egyptian king to a local ruler via the conduit of the provincial administration in Kumidi. And the Egyptian king requests that the ruler of Damascus send the Apiru of Amuru to Egypt with a view to resettling them to cities in Nubia. And Nubia is Kurkasha in Akkadian in line 9. Then the letter concludes with a brief eulogy of the Egyptian king, and next to nothing is known about Zalai of Damascus and Abdinilki of Shazaina. But what is important is that the 2 letters indicate that Kumidi acted as an intermediary between the pharaonic court and the local centers of power in the region. Text 3 and 4 are too fragmentary, whereas text 5 may document a connection between Kumidi and another political center to the south, Megiddo. And the personal name Biridia mentioned in the letter could be Viridia of Megiddo from the Amarna correspondence, and Anson Rainey pointed out a few linguistic similarities between this text and the Amarna letters from Megiddo, such as the transitive dt stem of the verb washaru and the unknown word shukamma or shukami. And Anson Rainey suggested that this letter was written after the death of Viridia of Megiddo by Viridia's successor to his rightful heir, to the Egyptian official in Kumidi. And for some unknown reason, the Egyptian official in Kumidi held certain items of Viridia's personal property, and we don't really understand why. Yeah. Text 6 is an incoming letter of unclear content addressed to the Rabû of Kumidi by Ilirapik of Byblos, and Ilirapik was son and successor to Ribhada. And in the Editio Princeps, Edzar did not understand the personal name in line 3, which he transliterated as Eshi Rabi, but then it's been interpreted as a writing of Ilirapik. And therefore, John Unegard interpreted the toponym Urumakla in line 5 as a peculiar orthography for the city of Byblos. And connections between Byblos and Kumidi are documented from the Amarna letters, and this text, the content is unclear, but it is interesting because it indicates the subordination of Ilirapik to the Rabû of Kumidi, and therefore adds an extra layer to the relations between Byblos and the pharaonic court that would otherwise be unknown from the Amarna letters alone. Text 7 is a small broken fragment that has only a handful of seemingly disconnected signs, and it is extremely interesting because according to Nadav Naaman, this was probably a school text. And this indicates that Akkadian was not only read and written, but also studied in Kumidi. And this may suggest that the Egyptians may have sought to maximize their control of the Levantine rulers by monopolizing the education of local scribes in Akkadian. And this opens up a whole series of questions about the sociolinguistics of the Egyptian empire, which I plan to look further into after my dissertation is completed. Then we have text 8 and 9 that come from the antiquities market, and text 8 is very problematic because it is significantly broken, and the left half is almost missing. And Daniel Arnaud and Nadav Naaman proposed vastly diverging reconstructions, and according to Arnaud, the text is an outgoing letter, the sender being the Rabû of Kumidi, and the addressee the ruler of Amurru. And in particular, Arnaud suggested that the plural forms in line 13 suggest that the addressee could be identified more specifically with Aziru of Amurru, who was sharing the power with his brothers. Nadav Naaman suggested the opposite, and the sender would be Aziru of Amurru, and the addressee would be the Rabû of Kumidi. And for a variety of reasons, I personally believe that Arnaud's reconstruction is more plausible, so the sender is, in my opinion, the Rabû of Kumidi. And the content of the letter is very fragmentary, but the Sutians that I mentioned earlier are a clear topic of discussion, and this information connects this text to Amarna letters 122 and 123 from the Ribhada dossier that I showed to you earlier. And the verb laku, to take, in association with the Sutians in this text, also occurs in Amarna letter 123, and in which Ribhada complains about the Sutians taking away some citizens of Byblos. And it is very unclear what the circumstances are. And similarly obscure is the mention of Hatti in line 12, which seems rather out of context and does not appear in Nadav Naaman reconstruction of the text. So Hatti was read only by Arnaud. Finally, text 9 was published by John Unegard in 1996, and among all the texts from Kumidi is probably the densest with historical information. And Unegard suggested that the sender of the letter should be read as Illyrapic in line 2, and this is highly plausible both on orthographic and historical grounds. And so is the defective writing of Byblos in line 15. Kumidi is not mentioned at any point in the text, but the tablet is part of a group of objects that originated from the art that were purchased on the art market by the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and they are almost certainly from Kumidi. So, if you read the text, the addressee should be the Rabû of Kumidi, and Illyrapic states his subordination to the Rabû of Kumidi in the opening address. Then Illyrapic refers to a previous message in which he reported to the Egyptian administration that two local rulers, Amurapi and Amunira, have now sided with Adziru of Amuru. And Amurapi is a very common Amorite name, whereas Amunira is known from 6 Amarna letters as the ruler of Beirut. And Amunira offered protection to Ribhad of Byblos in his final days after Ribhada lost control over his own city of Byblos. And this connection between Byblos and Beirut points towards an identification of Amunira in this text with Amunira of Beirut in the Amarna letters. And this implies that Illyrapic was informing the Rabû of Kumidi that Beirut was abandoning the Egyptian sphere of influence in favor of Amuru. And in the subsequent passage, Illyrapic explains that he swore an oath with Adziru of that Amunira swore an oath with Adziru of Amuru, thereby committing an offense against the city of Byblos and the Egyptian king himself. Then we have a poorly understood passage in which Illyrapic claims to have entertained direct epistolary correspondence with the Egyptian king. And then Illyrapic recollects having sent a certain Nakia to Kumidi and demands that the Rabû of Kumidi send the Sutians, once again, this time to attack the city of Ibirta, which might be north of Byblos. And although the general circumstances of this episode are unclear, this passage is interesting because it contains yet another attestation of the Sutians in the affairs concerning Byblos and Kumidi. And it appears that the Rabû of Kumidi had authority over a group of Sutians who could take away people from other cities, but this practice is not really understood. And interestingly, Illyrapic pledges to pay the Sutians a high price for this service against the city of Ibirta. And the final passage indicates that the issue at stake this time is control over the city of Ibirta. And for this reason, Amurapi should be prevented from receiving military assistance from Adziru, and Illyrapic requests that the Rabû of Kumidi send 5 men through the embassy of Nakia to subtract the city of Ibirta from the Amuru enemies. So, as a concluding analysis, if we piece together all these different pieces of evidence, the Rabû of Kumidi seems to have acted as an intermediary between the pharaonic court and the local centers of power in Syria-Palestine. And his activity covered a relatively vast area, so Byblos seems to have had the closest connection to Kumidi, but other cities included Damascus, Kadesh, the unidentified town of Shazaena, and possibly also Megiddo, Beirut, and the polity of Amuru. And the task of the Rabû of Kumidi was essentially twofold: the protection and security of these territories within the Egyptian sphere of influence, not only from the Apiru outlaws, but also from treacherous vassals. And his second duty was intelligence data gathering for the pharaonic court. And his knowledge of the local political situation is not only implied in many of these texts, but it can also be deduced from the fact that the local rulers constantly supply the Rabû of Kumidi with first-hand information about security threats, and shifting alliances. And the Egyptian imperial administration must have relied upon this kind of information for the successful planning of its imperial strategy in the Levant. And the choice of Kumidi for this security and intelligence center is easily explainable, because from a geographical point of view, it was protected by the mountain ranges of the Lebanon, the anti-Lebanon, and the Hermon. And at the same time, it was well connected to the Mediterranean coast, to Galilee, and to central and northern Syria. On a socio-political level, it was a wealthy town with a seemingly pro-Egyptian elite, because they were appropriating all these Egyptian objects. And it may not have been as divided in opposing factions as larger and more complex cities such as Byblos and Damascus, and we do know of opposing factions, political factions in cities such as Byblos and Damascus. And all these factors, I think, turned the city of Kumidi into the big eye, as I said in the title, of the Egyptian government, and as a center for security and order for the local communities in the Egyptian imperial periphery in the Levant. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Federico? Yes.
Well, thank you for this really insightful talk, Federico. I was wondering if the role of the Rabû and sort of Kumidi's sphere of influence under Egypt come across like in other texts from like other polities such as like el-Loz or other places sort of in the area?
Not that I'm aware of. I've done thorough research, and this is the only evidence I could find. So next to nothing from Egypt. The evidence I showed you is the best I could, the closest I could get to Kumidi, and mentions in the Amarna letters and the 9 texts. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a few kinds of questions. First, I think it's fascinating when you compare this to Nubia and how different it is, because they're still controlling foreign terrain, but it's so different in every way, shape, and form. I think that you can't compare. Even though it's a big frontier region, you're trying to exact economy and tribute. You don't have anyone like this Rabû. Maybe the king's son of Kush is the closest you have.
Yeah.
The question I have is, when did the Rabû institution extinguish and start? Or is that like no one knows?
No, so that's a very controversial topic, because so before dying, Rolf Ackman published this monograph on Kumidi, and he put together also the previous publications of the text. So there are like chapters written by Unegard and by Edzard in which they publish the text, and he ventures on this very controversial reconstruction of the events. And there is a vessel, an Egyptian vessel with the title Rawazir Atia, found in the Schatzhaus at Kumidi, and he connects it to the appointment of a Rabû at the time of Thutmose III. A vassal prince at the time of Thutmose III. Then this vassal proves treacherous, and Amenhotep III replaces him with a Rabû, but there is no evidence whatsoever. And this volume received 2 book reviews, one by Alexander Ahrens, that was very constructive, and then he received a destructive review by Eva von Dassault, and there is no evidence whatsoever for Ackman's. That's why my study is kind of a response to this discussion, because the only thing we can do is compile all the evidence and piece it together, and there is no evidence whatsoever for when the Rabû was appointed and when the institution ended. The thing is that we have most people say that the institution of the Rabû was no longer active
We're going to continue our list of presentations. First up, Declan Maloney, from Harvard University, the Milk Department, is going to be talking to us about the chronological framework of the dynastic period in Sumer, not the Egyptian one.
Okay.
Please give it up for Declan.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also a quick thank you as well. A proper thank you for bringing us all together like this.
Thank you.
I know it's a cliche to say, but these sorts of events are just so important for people like us to share and communicate ideas. And also a thank you to all the other people I know working behind the scenes tirelessly to bring all this together. So, the title: An Assessment of the Early 20th Century Chronological Framework of the Early Dynastic Period. And by that I mean I'm going to be breaking down the methodology employed by the excavators who created the term Early Dynastic Mesopotamia and its subsequent tripartite subdivision. So we should begin with a little series of biographies in history. In the early 1930s, the University of Chicago began a series of excavations in the Diyala region of Mesopotamia. They were led by field director Dr. Henri Frankfort, pictured here on the left, and on the right you can see some of the original field notes from the expedition. Frankfort was no slouch. By 1927 he had received his PhD from Leiden, and whilst doing so was also busy directing excavations at Tel el Amarna, Abydos, and Amman, Egypt. So, as a result of this series of expeditions, Frankfort and his team were able to plug a key gap in Assyriological studies, developing for the first time a complete chronological outline of over half of the 3rd millennium BC. Before this point, the early 3rd millennium had been referred to in scholarship by pretty vague titles: pre-Sargonic, Lagushite, Plano, Convex, that sort of thing. After this, we have the early dynastic period, which I appreciate is confusing for the Egyptologists in the crowd. I'm sorry, it's not my fault. So today, I would like to stress that I'm not overly concerned with the accuracy of these assessments of the 3rd millennium, but rather the methodology employed in the survey. Specifically, I'm focused on the question of the tripartite subdivision of the early dynastic period and whether or not the methodology properly stands the test of time. So to do this fairly, we need to begin with what was known of the archaeology by this period. If we're interested in when people started to write about Mesopotamia, perhaps we could point to this gentleman, one Rabbi Benjamin of Tudela. If we're interested in when any archaeology began whatsoever, we need look no further than the actual Mesopotamians themselves. Famously, King Nabonidus had an enormous collection of artifacts from his own people. It's important to bear in mind, however, that by the middle of the 19th century, cuneiform had been deciphered, and by the end of the century, state-sponsored excavations were in full swing. And by state-sponsored excavations, I of course mean blatantly imperialistic attempts to secure impressive artifacts for European museums, but you know, we all have to begin somewhere. So, what was actually known as of 1930? The Ubaid period, we have, fittingly, Tel el-Ubaid. In the Uruk period, we have the cities of Uruk and Kish. In the early dynastic period, although it's not called that yet, we have Ur, Shuruppak, and Lagash. And in the Akkadian period, we have Adab, this data following Matthew's 2003. So as we can immediately see, adequate, informed comparisons are going to be really difficult for these excavators to make, although it's not going to stop them trying. And it's also important to stress, as unbelievable as it might seem to the proper archaeologists in the crowd, no serious attempts at stratigraphy had ever been made before this point. So, like I said at the beginning, the key focus here is on methodology, not results, to give a fair assessment. He acknowledges himself in the first volume that the chief concern is to outline the already published static assemblages of the period, and that a proper synthesis of all available material would be very difficult to do. Unfortunately, this means that by our standards today, his attempts at doing this work are somewhat already stymied, but whatever. So how am I going to talk about this? Now, there was a long series of publications that resulted from these excavations. I'm going to be focusing in on 3, because the rest of them are essentially just publications of the items. The first one, Archaeology and the Sumerian Problem, which is the first attempt to actually define the beginning and the end of the early dynastic period. The second book is the 4th preliminary report of the Iraq expedition, which is the first proper outline of the tripartite subdivision of the early dynastic period. And the third book is the 5th preliminary edition, which says that it wishes to situate the prior publications into the broader historical framework. In reality, it functions as a nice little catalogue of publications and finds for us to talk about. So, the first book. Quote, the main outline, Frankfurt wishes to provide, quote, the main outline of the cultural development of Mesopotamia, independent of the individual history of any one site, essentially beginning with the earliest thing he can call Sumerian and work backwards until man emerges in Mesopotamia. This is rather romantic and grandiose, is it not? And should give you just some insight as to the level of, perhaps not scholarship, but the mindset of these early excavators going in. Less of what can the data tell us and what can we prove from this expedition. Now, how does he say he is going to do this? Primarily, he is going to cross-examine pottery assemblages to create a comparative stratigraphy to create his periods, and he's going to rely on the pictured Sumerian king list, which for those of you who are not necessarily in the know, is a wonderful but rather fanciful document that wants to begin with all the pre-flood kings and goes all the way down to around about the end of the 3rd millennium. Now, thanks to the fanciful figures contained within it, a few kings reigning for more than 1,000 years each, even at this time they were well aware that it is, quote, demonstrably corrupt. Now, this is what he says he is going to do. What does he actually do? Well, he does all that, and he compares and discusses bricks, temple architecture, and sculpture, and leans pretty heavily on other scholars for other sections. What's the issue with this? Essentially, it's extremely frustrating to be given lengthy justifications for the issues and considerations of working with one specific kind of artifact, and then to completely turn it on its head and do something else with it. This style of scholarship is pretty frustrating to engage with. And also, this is a point I'm going to have to keep returning to throughout this presentation, but the use, no matter how successful or how informed, of outlined, like one specific kind of evidence in one form from one area, even if you were able to find a stratigraphic sequence from every single area of Mesopotamia simultaneously, which they definitely do not have at this period, to decide something as nebulously complicated as an entire period of history is really poor archaeological practice. So, the first book, Defining an Era. How does he set out when the early dynastic period begins and ends? He starts with the, even known at this time, Sargon of Akkad's defeat of Lugal-Zaghazi of Umma. Poor old Lugal-Zaghazi pictured here on the right, stuck in a net, having his head bashed in. And this defeat is what kicks off the aforementioned Akkadian Empire period, which is the terminus post quem for the early dynastic. And I think I used that Latin right. Then, he says, Lugal-Zaghazi beats Uru-Kagina. And then he says, after Eduard Meyer, there is a 200-year gap to the next securely datable king, one Nanshe of Lagash. Reference can be found within Meyer's works to this 200-year figure, but he himself offers no evidence in that particular volume, referring only to a previous edition of his work with a footnote that appears to be almost completely unrelated to the publication. Neither page or section number contain any reference at all to the material cited. So we have this 200-year figure, which is difficult/impossible to verify. Then he follows the suggestion of C.J. Gadd that there's a 120-year gap. Firstly, it's important to stress Gad directly disagrees with Frankfurt as to when Ur-Nanshe, previously mentioned, lived. He reckons he lived a good 200 years earlier. Despite this glaring problem, Frankfurt is more than happy to continue to cherry pick through Gad's works and says that, Gad says there is a 120-year gap between the defeat of the city of Ur by Eannatum of Lagash, who was the son of Ur-Nanshe, mentioned before, which is still a securely datable event, which means we can move the sequence of kings into proper history. Gad says there's a 120-year gap from this defeat of the son of Ur-Nanshe to King Amenhotep of Ur. Gad says the Sumerian king list says this. Firstly, Amenhotep of Ur is not to be found in the Sumerian king list. His father, Mes-Amenhotep, is, but the numbers don't add up. There's a 97-year gap there. So far, 200 years can't be found, and 120 can't be found. Annoying. And then there's 100 years for consolidation, and then he arrives at 2900 BC, which fittingly is actually around about where we still think it is. And by the way, if you're unhappy with the for consolidation idea, I'd love to show you the full quote. This is my favourite thing I found writing this paper. Quote, "If we allow some more time for the consolidation of the early dynastic period, after the conclusion of the preceding one, we get near 2900 BC. Gut feelings abound. Serious history that continues through to today. I'll leave it up to you to decide. So, the second book, the Tel Asmar Hoard. This is, and here is the most famous example of the stuff they found at this Tel Asmar Hoard. It's worth emphasizing for a moment that this particular collection of stuff from the city of Tel Asmar is by far and away, by this point, the single largest collection of objects found in Mesopotamia. They find, I'm going to run through this really quickly, cylinder seals, stamp seals, bronze statuettes, mountable plaques, inlays, spouted sherds, pottery stands, stone vessels, animal-shaped objects, these votive figurines, and even houseplants. Bearing all this in mind, it is easy to understand how this enormous collection of stuff so vividly captured the imaginations of these early excavators. Now, I'm going to be talking for a moment about these two sites in particular. So on the left we have Tel Kafaji, and on the right we have Tel Asmar. I'm going to zoom in on the relevant bits for you. So on the left of Tel Kafaji, you can see, numbered with a 1, the temple oval, and a little bit to the right of that, number 3, you can see the Seen temple. And at Tel Asmar, you can see the Abu temple in the bottom left of that blow-up, which confusingly is one of the only times he refers to it as that in the publications. Usually he refers to it by each individual layer, which has a different name, and as a reader you are also left to figure that out. It's worth mentioning as well that the names of the Abu temple phases, there's the archaic at the lowest, then the square temple, and then the single shrine. Now hopefully this will become obvious as I go through it. So how does he want to do this? Periodization through comparison. I love this photo. It's wonderfully illustrative of the whole temple layer thing, but my frustration with it is that the caption and the textual reference to this particular figure put each layer at a different time. They really needed a better editor for these books. So, initially, he focuses on the single shrine, that is the latest layer of the Abu temple at Tel Asmar, on the temple oval of Tel Kafaji, and the royal cemetery of Ur. He focuses specifically on the following types of objects: rubbish layers, similar copper objects, and similar materials from Tel Asmar and Tel Kafaji. Which layer of the temple oval he is referring to these items coming from when he's talking about that, at no point does he say. He just merely leaves the reader with, quote, "Not only does the pottery confirm this division, but the same can be said of the beads found in Shrine 1 of the Square Temple." Unhelpful. So, on the next couple of slides, rather than show you a whole wall of text, I've tried to tabulate this data that he puts forward for the subdivisions of the early dynastic period, the periodization, if you will. Please note that nothing is to scale, with the exception of where each box begins and ends, or overlaps. So for example, on the left, the single shrine layer of the Abu temple at Tel Asmar begins before the final stage / period of the temple oval. That was deliberately ambiguously worded and thus labelled on the diagrams to reflect Frankfort's total inconsistency in discussing the different temporal layers, sections, periods of the same temple. Please note that the items in bold are considered the key pieces of evidence for the tripartite subdivision. Frankfort initially divides the early dynastic period into two on the basis of the aforementioned evidence, suggesting that the square temple layer and the first or second periods of the temple oval are earlier because of the beads quote that it turns out I read a slide early, so sorry about that. The reason it says beads in first and second is because the beads were apparently found, quote, in a grave dug after the first stage of the oval was completed but before the next build. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to go down on the notes on here. I'm going to have to use the cursor. Please bear with me. Technology. Yeah, so he doesn't actually specify when the beads were found, and yet he's more than happy to use them as one of his key pieces of evidence for this first subdivision, which is... On the right, you can see that he dates the single shrine layer and the royal cemetery to be contemporaneous and later in time because of the unspecified, uncited, unfootnoted copper object and because of the rubbish infills of the previous layer. So far, so sketchy. Ploughing right along. On the left, we have early dynastic 2. On the right, we have early dynastic 3. I have represented the Scene Temple on the left with checked lines because by Frankfort's own admission, it was not fully excavated at the time, although that doesn't stop him from trying to include it in his historical reconstruction. On this, he even goes so far as to tentatively totally synchronize the layers of the temple oval and the Scene Temple, which I will reiterate, he does not even know how old it is or how many layers it has, but he says it must be the same as the temple oval. On this slide, I have added the infamous geometric and realistic statuettes, which you will note are found very inconsistently at the Diyala sites. Most notably, the second layer of the Scene Temple has both kinds. The second layer of the temple oval has the realistic variety, and the Abu temple of Tel Asmar distributes them more evenly. Please note that the realistic statuettes found at the temple oval are in the second stage, although are considered fundamental evidence for the existence of early dynastic 3. On the right, we can see a lot of question marks for the key evidence. Frankfort tells us, quote, "We have been struck from the beginning by the close resemblances between our discoveries at Kafagi and those at citing one example of a plaque from Kafagi with 0 stratigraphic detail, with another found at with 0 stratigraphic detail. He says that similar objects to those found at were found at private houses in Tel Kafagi, which date to the third layer of the temple oval, but of course, he doesn't tell us which layer of he means when he says that. So, to summarize all that, we have early dynastic 1 as represented by the archaic shrine of Tel Asmar and the first oval of Tel Kafagi. If you're surprised to see the archaic shrine in this reconstruction, so was I. Here's my favourite pair of contrasting quotes. Page 79, quote, "The archaic shrine we must leave out of the present report, since it is not yet fully excavated." Page 86, quote, "It seems then, if we take into account the archaic shrine, as well as the square temple and the single shrine temple, that the early dynastic period went through 3 stages." Maybe he wrote this in collaboration with someone else. I really can't be sure. But less than 10 pages. Early dynastic 2 is represented by the geometric statuettes of Tel Asmar and the Scene Temple. Early dynastic 3 is represented by the royal cemetery, the realistic statuettes of Tel Asmar, and the houses and grave goods of Tel Kafagi. Book 3, the perfect microcosm. In theory, like I said, it's supposed to situate everything into the proper historical framework. In reality, it's just a really nice summation of one of the fundamental issues with this scholarship, and that is that the entire catalogue, with the exception of one item from Kish, of items that are supposed to represent the entirety of the early Dynastic II period for the entirety of Mesopotamia, are objects that are found only in the Diyala River Valley and only at 2 sites. I also think it's fair, because I've bashed on them so much, that I should show you some pictures of these statuettes. So on the left, you can see 2 of what he considers to be the quintessential examples of geometric statues. And on the right, the 2 quintessential, the best examples he can come up with for the realistic depictions. I would also like to note that the female figure on the right hand, whilst arguably, in my opinion, the best example of early Dynastic III that he actually cites, he dismisses as treated as never a serious sculptural problem. I'd like to say a quick word in his defence before I go into the scholarly responses and absolutely tear him to shreds. Much of his work on art history still remains relevant and useful today. Having the vision to create a full chronological explanation of Mesopotamia with the amount of information he had is extremely admirable. On the other hand, it's also very, very bold to try and create and extrapolate so much from such a small amount of data. And this is perhaps the most important thing I have to say on this slide, many of the most critical scholarly responses are based on an understanding that he could not have had, i.e. that the Diyala was a peripheral region, neither properly northern nor southern Mesopotamia, which many of the people who came after him had the benefit of knowing. So, the key scholarly responses. You can summarize them in 3 different ways, and the first is that the early Dynastic II period is barely findable even within the Diyala Valley itself. My favourite quote of all the scholars here, Anne Perkins' review of Delugas, which was one of the aforementioned publications that was just a collection of items, and she says, early Dynastic II is practically non-existent outside of the Diyala area. Murray says much the same thing 30 years on. Quote, the early Dynastic II period was brief and not clearly distinguished in the local ceramic repertory. The second, and this is something I touched upon at the start of the presentation, as put by Moon, it's essentially not a brilliant idea to take just pottery or ceramics, pottery or statuettes or whatever it may be, as one type of artifact and then point this as being broadly representative. He specifically says, quote, should not be accepted as the norm for southern Mesopotamia or anywhere else. And then the second half of the Weiss quote is just brilliant. Quote, that this periodization, early dynastic, has even less meaning outside the Diyala was clearly stated over 20 years ago in this journal, has been reiterated ever since, which is a direct reference to the Perkins quote I read to you before. The final scholarly point, the most amusing to me, is that Professor Mallowan takes the exact same set of data and the exact same pool of evidence and suggests that suggests a completely different reconstruction based on the same pool of available data. I don't know enough, and I don't have the time in this paper to comment on whether or not either of them are properly correct. All I would like to say is that if these two esteemed scholars are capable of taking the same pool of evidence and coming up with completely different responses, then something is seriously awry. In conclusion, scholarship from the century ago has not aged terribly well. On the flip side, our understanding as a historical, archaeological, philological, art historical discipline has improved exponentially. There is a ton of hope for the future, essentially. Many of the fundamental works which have since defined crucial aspects of Assyriology are, much like this one, likely in need of a critical re-examination. And lastly, that the early dynastic period is in serious need of revisiting and probably shouldn't be considered representative for the entirety of Mesopotamia. That's my bibliography. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Are there any questions, comments, ideas, suggestions?
I do have one. Hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you a question. Have you or do you think that it could be worth going through the archives of Henry Frankfurt to see if in his documentation there is more information that for whatever reason he never published or he never considered important to justify his arguments?
I truthfully have not considered that. The sole reason being that, seriously, just reading those 3 books, I was capable of producing a very long-term paper. I can't tell you just how much information I had to leave out in order to make this an even close to the time limit presentation. However, that is a wonderful suggestion. Thank you very much for it. I'm hopefully, time permitting, we'll get right on with it, because I really can't tell you. I have really had to cherry pick the most relevant and the most egregious pieces of information to get into this, and I'm sure that there is much I'm missing. So thank you for that.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you for that. I wonder, have you spent any time, and this is like, I can understand this takes like so long to even like put through all this here, like I've done a little bit myself and it's terrible. Do you have any kind of sense of kind of comparing what Frankfurt wrote and then compared it to some of the more recent excavation reports from like southern Mesopotamian sites to see discrepancies or kind of any, because for example, like at Lagash we're still using like Frankfurt's terminology and everything, so which is probably problematic, but we still do anyways. So can you see any kind of glaring errors coming out of comparisons of this older material versus kind of newer publications?
So thank you very much for that question. It's very relevant, and if I were to take this project far more seriously and do something much longer form with it, that is exactly what I would need to do. Now is a good moment to shout out the article that inspired this talk in the first place. Gene Evans wrote a paper in 2007 on the early dynastic period, and Frankfurt and Tel Asmar. And what happened was I got about 4 pages into this article, found out that Frankfurt was nowhere near as sacrosanct as I thought he was, then downloaded all the original publications and ended up in this rabbit hole which resulted in being here today. I will be honest, no, I have not. I have not had the time. I would love to, but I'm also unsure about my personal level of archaeological expertise. Essentially, I could read it. I'm not sure how much I would get out of it right now, but that is exactly what I want to do with it. And I know that I'm not alone in doing this, and it's very much exactly what needs to be done. It's fascinating to hear that they're still using that terminology in Lagash.
Well, so Lagash is, it basically only has early dynastic occupation and not really anything before and not anything after. And so it would be interesting to see, especially with that site, since it only represents mostly early dynastic stuff, kind of comparisons between that material and what Frankfurt was doing with Diala. That's all.
No, thank you for that.
So I think just from more of an archaeology perspective, which is what I'm working on mostly, is there was, of course, I would agree with trying to look at the archives that Henry left behind, because I'm pretty sure that what you're going to find is that the publication does not reflect his notes or diaries or anything like that. Because you're going to find that there's a whole social network in which he was involved, so you mentioned that's another one. When Diala was basically salvaged, because that's what it was, that was in the 30s, right? And a lot of the excavations were done in a haphazard way, whereby they couldn't record context and so on all over. And I'm pretty sure that in the records he would probably be frustrated about that as well. Reisner had similar, the guy I'm working on, he had similar funny quotes in his diaries that would reveal that his publication is not up to his own specs, but he had to work with what he had. So I think that's definitely a good starting point to sort of take this further, because I think it is important to revise these ancient standing frameworks that people still quote all the time, and you're like, why? On the other hand, is there an alternative? Not yet. So a gap to fill.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely got to look into that. I will say that he sort of oscillates, interestingly, between being very confident and extremely tentative. But the middle ground, I think, maybe it's just as a case of as he was writing it and as he was going through it, he became surer and surer and surer in his head that what he was saying was correct. I'm sure that the uncritical adoption of his work later on boosted that. But I'd love to see a little bit more of that humility. I'm sure he was aware that what was going on was not 100% ideal. But
and I would definitely look into sort of the social environment in which he was constructing this, because it happens all the time where, you know, you kind of want to say this in print, but then on the other hand, you don't want to go against your colleague, Max Maloney, for example, by saying something that he wouldn't like, and then he could like make your life miserable, particularly during this time. So, all right, well, thank you. Any other questions, or are we? No? All right, great. Well, join me in thanking you. Moving on to Rebekah Vogel from the University of Memphis, who's going to talk to us about effective words, textual iconography, and New Kingdom triumph scenes. Oh, don't worry about it. Carefully, don't trip.
Yeah, I'm just short enough to actually trip on.
Oh, would you like some feedback on your?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm shorter than everyone
And we
else.
still have.
Does that sound good?
I might be out of feedback forms.
All right, so I've just embarked on starting my dissertation research, which focuses on the diachronic development and composite usage of iconographic and textual elements in New Kingdom triumph scenes with topographical lists. An example of which you see here. Egyptologists in the room will be familiar with these. I don't know about the rest of you. But today I'm presenting a very small and very preliminary subset of my research, particularly regarding the iconic usage of rhetorical texts within these particular scenes. So, as we know, or at least the Egyptologists know, I'm just going to brush over this for the rest of you guys. The monumental triumph motif was one of the most vivid displays of Egyptian royal power, particularly during the New Kingdom. It was also an important vehicle for which state-sanctioned ideology was reinforced and disseminated using pictorial and textual content. This paper is concerned with the nature of the rhetorical texts that appear in these scenes and their function in the composite context. I argue that in this context, the rhetorical texts function iconically, mirroring and reinforcing the ideological meaning of the images and adding depth and nuance to that meaning, which is lacking in the pictorial images alone. This purpose is achieved through the use of literary forms, structures, and frequent allusions to the cultural, historical, geographical, and mythological ideas that upheld the ideology of the Egyptian state. So, before I get too far in, I want to kind of contextualize these rhetorical texts for this particular context and define the term icon as I'm using it here. So these texts are fairly well known, but are often described as conventional or stereotyped in earlier literature. For some of the formulaic texts, such as protection formulae or life, prosperity, and health formulae, this is a fair assessment. However, even the more complex rhetorical texts have often been treated in this way. But the regularity in the rhetorical text should be understood as intentional selection for iconic elements which reflect intended ideological messages rather than standardization for standardization's sake. Like their pictorial counterparts, the rhetorical texts that appear in triumph scenes were adapted and tailored over time and intentionally selected to serve as representations of specific ideas and to convey distinct ideological and symbolic messages. An icon, when defined here as a metaphorical visual image, I'm using Anthony Spallinger's definition here, from whom I draw most of my theoretical framework for this paper. When defined in this way, this certainly includes the pictorial elements of triumph scenes, but this definition also allows for the rhetorical text to be interpreted this way. These texts stand as representations of abstract concepts related to royal power, the ideology of kingship, and the relationship between Egypt and the rest of the cosmos. They're also a quintessential example of the fluidity with which the hieroglyphic script functioned as both text and image. But for an icon to function properly, to be effective as a metaphorical visual image, its meaning must exist outside of a specific time and place, it must be recognizable, and it must draw on cultural and symbolic traditions not explicitly stated, but easily understood in the proper context. Rhetorical texts within New Kingdom triumph scenes do all three of these things really well. But what do the texts themselves look like? On the screen, you'll see a primary example that I will be using. Let's call it the quintessential version of this particular scene. This comes from the east wing of the triumph scene of Seti I on the exterior, northern exterior wall of the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak Temple. And this will be my sort of case study for the rest of this paper, really. Delineated in red are the texts that are pertinent to this discussion. So the rhetorical texts in New Kingdom triumph scenes usually take the form of either divine speeches, or in, wow, just tripping over myself there. Divine speeches or extended captions. The divine speeches regularly include exaltations of the king's deeds and confirmation of divine sanction for those deeds, proclamations of the extent of the king's dominion, lists of epithets and attributes of the king, and wishes for the continued life, prosperity, health, success, etc. of the king himself. Extended captions often describe the action of the full scene, or less commonly, some of the figures within the scene. While the structure of the text is easily recognizable, they have literary qualities which suggest iconic functionality without complete standardization of the internal content. These literary qualities are borne out by grammar, syntax, and frequent poetic structures and motifs. So for a quick overview of the grammar and syntax, I'm not a philologist, so this is more of a high-level overview here. Turning to grammar, the divine speeches and extended captions favor verb tenses which suggest repetitive, perpetual, or timeless acts. In particular, the speeches often employ the so-called imperfective, sejmef, but very commonly also the stative, which indicates acquisition of a quality or state as the result of prior action, not the action itself. However, I should note that these two verbal forms are not used in exclusion of other verbal forms. These are just the most common. In extended captions, when verbs are present, which does not always happen, they tend to appear in the narrative infinitive, which is typical of label texts in other contexts, such as a description of the king's ritual act in cultic scenes. The consistent use of these verb forms serves to remove the action from ordinary linear time and emphasize the typicality and non-transitory nature of both the actors and the actions presented. This sort of timelessness is also reflected in the pictorial iconography, and while the content of the texts clarifies and describes these images, the grammar prevents them from going so far as to fix the images in space or time. As far as syntax goes, the verbal constructions within the divine speeches in particular can be variable, which accounts for the majority of the syntactic variation within the text itself. These speeches usually follow a similar structure, beginning with vocative sections of address from the god to the king, which can contain lengthy enumerations of the king's names, titles, and epithets. This is followed by descriptions of what the king has done, what the god intends to do for the king, and figurative descriptions of the king's might, power, and dominion. Following this, the god lauds the king's deeds and details his own role in the king's success. While the content varies, the sentences included in these sections are often repetitive, beginning with the same phrases in each sentence or repeating the exact same syntax through multiple sentences. Syntactically, the extended captions do not vary as greatly, but the purpose of the text is often the same, to effectively label an image, a goal which is best served with repetitive formulaic sentence structures. Captions that label the action of the entire scene often begin with the narrative infinitive, followed by the direct object, An actor, when included, which doesn't always happen, is usually attached to the verb indirectly rather than as a grammatical subject, either in the form of a possessed infinitive, i.e. the king slaying, or a prepositional phrase indicating means or instrument, i.e. slaying by the king. For example, the scene label on the east wing of the Seti I triumph scene, which you see here, begins Sakarweru slaying the chiefs, etc., so on and so forth. On the west wing, the result of the king's action is apparent in the figural label describing those who were defeated, being an assemblage of foreign lands which his majesty slew. In addition to grammatical and syntactic concerns, literary structures using figurative language are also employed in the composition of the divine speeches. In the example you see here, again from the Seti triumph scene, Amun-Re ends his speech to the king with a full 8 lines. You only have 5, but there are 8. With a full 8 lines, beginning with the phrase, Di Masen Hemek Em, I cause them to see your majesty as, and then he lists various metaphorical forms in which the king is caused to appear to his enemies. This structure, as well as the discrete content, recalls other poetic texts, like that of the Poetical Stela of Thutmose III. The Poetical Stela not only employs the same literary motif of the god causing foreigners to see the king as various different things, but a number of these figurative comparisons are identical. The motif has a longer history dating back to at least the Middle Kingdom in other contexts, most notably in the speech of the divine snake in the story of the shipwrecked sailor, for those of you who are familiar with it. The poetic comparisons in this portion of the texts rely on identification of the power and actions of the king with those of a raging animal or the sheer power of natural or divine phenomena, highlighting the overt violence and instantaneousness of the king's actions. For example, here the king appears in various forms, like a thunderbolt, as a bull, as a crocodile, like a blast of fire, like the manifestations of Sekhmet in her pestilence, like a fierce lion, like a jackal. All of these comparisons remind the viewer that while the entire scene may be timeless, the act of smiting itself is completed instantaneously, thus providing reassurance of the king's victory and the foreigner's defeat. For some more figurative language, another example, again, from the speech of Amun-Re in the Seti I scene. Here the god says D-E, Her-E, R, direction, via and ek, listing all of the different directions in turn. He turns his face or puts his face toward each direction and works a wonder for the king. He details each wonder that he has done, usually one which directly relates to the direction that he's addressing at the time. For example, when he addresses the west, he destroys for the king the Chehenu lands, the lands of Libya. This poetic motif is also known from other contexts, most notably from the Blessing of Amun section in the Stela of Amenhotep III from his mortuary temple, which is identical or nearly identical in content and structure for some portions. In addition to other figurative language such as this, epithets and other laudatory descriptors of the king have had a long history in literary and rhetorical texts, and it's no surprise that in these scenes where the king is the primary actor, these also occur a lot. In this context, the king's epithets tend to highlight his physical strength and his martial prowess, but with particular focus on the perpetuity of his actions, as well as the direct relationship between his strength and the foreigner's defeat, as well as the relationship of the foreigners themselves to the physical body of the king. Throughout the triumph scene text, the king is referred to by such epithets as possessor of the strong arm, Horus the strong-armed, one who smites, one who tramples, and master of action. The foreigners themselves are often said to be slaughtered or overthrown under his sandals. Epithets and descriptors such as these clearly reinforce the physicality and martial ability of the king in subduing the foreign countries, but they also parallel exactly the action taking place in the pictorial icons. As part of the literary nature of this text, they include copious amounts of historical and cultural allusions, which are integral to understanding the iconicity of these texts. Both the divine speeches and extended captions are rife with allusions that draw on cultural, historical, religious, and geographic knowledge and context that ancient audiences would have had, subtly but effectively reinforcing the sanctioned worldview that the pictorial icons displayed. Because these allusions are so common in the text, I've chosen to speak only on two salient examples here. Oblique references to foreign peoples, lands, and enemies are ubiquitous in triumph scenes. The 9 bows, who my Egyptologists will be familiar with, the traditional enemies of Egypt, as it were, are mentioned at least once in every triumph scene, basically, and sometimes multiple times. The constituent peoples of the 9 bows are often individually enumerated, but whether they're listed separately or jointly, they do not necessarily refer just to those 9 groups of people, but rather the symbolic plurality of pluralities, all people in all lands. Here you can see an example, again from the Seti scene, part of the topographical list, which has 9 bows names, 9 bows peoples intermixed with other toponyms. The names of the 9 bows would have been easily recognizable to literate Egyptians viewing the scene, and their iconography would probably have been even more widely recognizable. The consistent mention of the 9 bows in this context subtly reinforces the totality of the king's dominion over all peoples, in all places, historically, presently, and in the future, regardless of politics, geography, or in sometimes reality. Another common form of allusion in the rhetorical texts consists of descriptions of the martial prowess and physical strength of the king, but in this case with references to specialized weaponry, such as hepesh swords, maces, clubs, and chariots. These instruments of violence, some of which were closely tied to the office of kingship since the pre-dynastic, hint at the necessary role violence played in the king's ability to maintain order and uphold the sanctioned worldview. In smiting scenes predating the New Kingdom, from which much of this iconography is ultimately derived, the weapon wielded by the king to slay his enemies is variable, although hepesh swords, maces, and clubs were the most common. While smiting images in the New Kingdom, like you see here from the Temple of Menedid-Habu, hepesh swords and clubs were usually the ones that dropped out by this time, and it was really maces in the New Kingdom that they preferred to picture in the smiting image itself. However, recollection of these other weapons in the text harkens back to the long historical and iconographic tradition of enemy smiting that had already existed for millennia. This is further underscored by the fact that the hepesh sword, which is so common in earlier images like this, is recalled in the text, but it's also recalled in the images where the god who is speaking to the king hands him the hepesh sword as his method of divinely sanctioning the violence which the king is currently engaged in. So, given all of that, how then do these texts function as icons? A sense of timelessness is achieved in these texts through the use of verbal forms which suggest perpetual and repetitive action, or in some cases non-action, with no clear beginning or end relative to linear time. A sense of placelessness is drawn from the repetition of generic nomenclature and repetitive descriptions of foreign enemies and the act of the king in smiting them. Additionally, these texts clearly draw on literary formats and formulae which dated back to earlier iterations of triumph scenes and smiting scenes in the Old and Middle Kingdoms, as well as literary texts and royal inscriptions from other contexts. This literal continuity of the texts themselves also establishes the cultural tradition from which they are drawn. The texts are made all the more identifiable and all the more familiar to their audience because they draw their structures, themes, and even sometimes discrete sections of content from an existing literary and poetic repertoire. This then begs a further question. Why would the Egyptians have chosen to express the king's triumph in this way? Well, functioning as icons, the rhetorical texts expand the symbolic effectiveness of the scene as a whole by reiterating and highlighting the most important aspects of the imagery. They represent the same ideas in a different format, which reinforces the ideological paradigms already in play, including the king's total dominion, the role of violence in the maintenance of order, and the necessity of the king, the Egyptian king himself, to be the divinely sanctioned violent actor who performs this particular ritual act. But perhaps most importantly, the textual icons provide clarification and nuance to the themes presented in the images and the full scene without negating the eternal nature of the scene itself. In addition to the perpetuity indicated by the grammar, the figurative language, the allusion, epithets, metaphors, etc., allows the actions of the king to be discussed symbolically rather than literally, which keeps those actions and their necessary ferocity explicit without tying them to one distinct time period or locale. Here, the textual icons help to balance the levels of specificity and universality presented in triumph scenes. Each king is an individual and performs triumphant actions in his own time, but all kings serve as a reflection of the office of kingship and its eternal dominion over foreign peoples and places. It is the textual icons, not the pictorial icons, which most coherently resolve the dichotomic relationship between these two aspects of kingship and the king in his role as triumphant subjugator of foreign lands. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Oh, and here's a selected bibliography. Very small. Yes.
So you say that the grammar choices of the verbs they're using tells you about the eternal or repetitive nature of the actions. That if you go, maybe you can go back to all the that
This one?
yeah. So I may be wrong, but I think that the DE or the DF form as an imperfective cannot be an initial form. So that means that this one should be kind of like a subjunctive similar. Correct me. Maybe
As
if
a,
I'm wrong.
I'm not a philologist, so.
So in which case it wouldn't be I cause them to see your majesty, but may I cause them to see
Which
your majesty.
still does not necessarily fix it in time or space.
No, but
If
it's kind of giving a model or of the use.
Yes, and like I said, this is very preliminary research, and I haven't been able to compare this to a whole lot of other texts yet. I'm kind of just in the beginning stages of doing that. However, I was wrestling with the grammatical forms here, but I do believe that even if you take it as a subjunctive, maybe perhaps as expressing a wish for the future, that the it doesn't necessarily still place it somewhere in space or time. It just, the timelessness is rendered differently, I suppose, if you take it as a subjunctive rather than an imperfective. But either way, I think it refrains from structuring the text and structuring the scenes at a specific place and time, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I agree. It's just that I don't know if you've seen in other scenes of smiting, if they use the same verb forms.
They do.
They use
This is the one that I've had the most familiarity with. I've written a few papers on this particular scene before, which is why I used it as my primary example. I have done some comparative work with some of the other scenes, particularly the Ramses III scenes at Habu, which have a lot of the same literary forms and a lot of the same verbal forms, and kind of have poetic structures pulled from other places as well.
Okay. And the infinitives, they are, it's always for the smiting scene itself, right? Just like
Yes, usually the full text or the full scene is labeled with a narrative infinitive caption of the smiting, and it's usually the smiting that's being described. There are other cases of captions relating to specific people or actors in the text, but normally the primary caption is always the smiting of whichever group of foreigners is being listed at the time, and it usually begins Seker, whoever, just in your normal narrative infinitive.
Okay, because, I mean, and this is just thinking, you know, like out loud. Could maybe the king smiling, like the image of the king, be considered the subject of that sentence? in that case you wouldn't be considering it as seker as an infinitive, but seker I, and it will have the same.
I mean, it very much could be. It would have essentially the same meaning, but it would further integrate the texts and the images at that point, which is something I need to look into. I haven't gotten too far into it, but I suspect that the imagery and the texts themselves are actually much more intertwined in these scenes than has been previously discussed, I think.
So I have a question about the presence of divinity in this kind of things, because I might be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I think the focal point of a lot of smiting is actually usually the king
Yes.
instead of the god. So I just wonder, do you make a special case for that? And if we have divine speeches in that kind of scenes, and if we do, how does that function?
And I do believe you're right. The king, in this particular type of scene, the king is the primary actor. The king is the focus of what's going on in the scene. And the deities that show up in these scenes, particularly as the primary witnessing deity who's handing a sword to the king and speaking to him, all of the actions that the god does, anything that the god says, are all in reference to the king. He's talking to the king, he's handing things to the king, he's there in support of the king, essentially. And in the speeches, they the god will list the things that he has done for the king, the things he intends to do for the king, and doesn't really talk about much else other than the king and his relationship to the king. So I think the presence of the deities just reiterates the divine sanction for the king.
Right, so I guess, sorry, let me rephrase my question. So if the presence of deity in this case is to sanction violence, in terms of scenes without the presence of deity, how does violence get sanctioned in those cases? Do you have any insight?
In the New Kingdom triumph scenes, there's not a lot of examples, at least with the monumental scenes, there's not a lot of examples where there isn't a deity present to be a sanctioning figure. However, in earlier iterations of triumph scenes and smiting scenes more generally, it's more variable whether or not there is a deity present. And that's actually one of the things that I'm looking at for my dissertation, is sort of the diachronic development of this kind of imagery and this motif in general. And I haven't really had a chance to look at too much of the earlier evidence yet, but even in Old Kingdom examples, you have usually a deity standing there, not always handing something, but at least watching the scene, being there. This doesn't always occur, but it is very common. So I think it just sort of develops over time to be a necessary element in this whole idea. Yes.
You mentioned, I don't do anything. I don't know nothing about Egyptology, so just correct me if I'm completely off base here. But you said that there are divine speeches and extended captions, yeah?
Yes.
Is there any relationship between the image and the text in terms of where the actual writing is located throughout triumph scenes? Is there any, or do they have any correlation, or is there a pattern?
Insofar as, okay, so let me, I don't know if we have a pointer, but I can use my small arms here. So this giant rectangular box at the top is the speech of Amun in this scene. This down here is the description of the foreign peoples. The one under Amun's arm with the sword, that is the second half of his speech. That's the poetic section that starts with the same few words at the beginning of each section. And next to the king's arm, right above the heads of these poor unfortunate foreigners, that is the scene caption.
So there is typically, are they typically sort of near each other in that way?
They're usually structured, at least in the New Kingdom examples, these texts regularly occur in these general areas. So the god's speech will be near the top and usually somewhere around the god's body, not always in the exact same place, but usually pretty close to the god himself. The scene caption and any extended, portions of the god's speech that don't fit get pushed a little bit closer to the king. And then normally the description of the foreigners will be down here under the feet of the foreigners and the king. And then, yeah, that's it. And then usually in these larger scenes, there's often topographical lists attached, which go, flanking the entire scene.
Just a few comments on some of the topics you brought up. With the grammar, there is some forms of the Sejm NF and the T, which would generally consist of marking infinity. So the grammar would change from example to example, as I said, particularly when you compare the poetical stilo from Moses the Third,
Right.
Which does have Sejm NF, so which changes the temporality of the text. The thing that I always ponder about these triumph scenes, I think is really difficult, because triumph scenes occur everywhere from stelae to temples. But the question is, are they doing the same thing in those two different contexts? So when you've got a temple, usually relief, it goes with a set cultic practice. And I think that's the difficult thing about triumph scenes. It's not overtly obvious to Egyptologists what the cultic practice is that goes with these texts. It sounds, usually everyone uses ideology and royal ideology and we own the world. But that's not an actual cultic practice, that's just a statement of what they own. And the question, I think Joachim Quack has tried to broach this a bit when he talks about execration texts in the temple. Is there a actual procession or something that goes with this?
And execration texts are actually something that I'm looking at as some of my earlier evidence.
So you have a physical ritual that goes
Yes.
with presumably something like this, but the clay figurines aren't depicted here, so we don't have the same kind. Do you have any way of fleshing that out a bit more?
Not at the moment. That's one of the central questions that I will hopefully be dealing with in my dissertation, but I haven't really had a chance to look into that too much yet. There's obviously quite a lot that goes into these scenes, both iconographically and textually, and so I'm kind of working on tracing back all of those things in time and where they're coming from and what they're being attached to, and sort of how they all come together in this sort of final iteration. But I am looking at the execration text actually at the moment, as well as execration figurines, and I suspect that there is, at least related to the temple examples, there has to be some sort of physical cultic ritual involved here that just hasn't really been discussed as much as necessary. And I also think that that sort of performative practice would really expand our understanding of the text and the images in these scenes, not only in this context, but then you can also extrapolate to what these scenes are doing in other contexts from that, I think. And so that's sort of where my brain is going with that.
One more, Declan?
Thank you, that was really, really interesting. Although, similar disclaimers to before, I'm sorry, I've forgotten everything Egyptological, but that was wonderful, thank you. Very quick question. The direction scene, going north, east, west, earth, sky, not south. Is it just because they're starting at the south and murdering their way upwards, or is south not significant? Or?
I wonder that sometimes, and I do believe there are a few cases where, not necessarily in this particular format, but they do talk about the south in a very similar way. Honestly, I don't know why they left out the south on this one. It might be because they pulled this text directly from the the Amenhotep III stela, and potentially just it wasn't in that one, and so it didn't show up here. But
epigraphic space is another.
yeah, space is always an important thing, and they usually do like that adding this element of him getting lost into the narrative, as it were, is intentionally liminalizing this entire place. His ability to get there, the fact that he gets lost before he gets there, is sort of separating it from the normal world, from normal everyday life and things that everyone can access. And this divine intervention is only possible, is only necessary because he can't find it on his own. And I think that is one way of, I guess, contextualizing why he seems to be so proud of being lost in the desert when he shouldn't be lost in the desert at all. Where it's not his failing that makes him lost, but it's the liminality of the place itself. and he is eventually able to then gain access to that place?
Definitely, yeah, I definitely agree with this. And also because he is the first one to gain access, so of course at first is
That makes it better.
yeah. So, last speaker of today, last but not least, Raleigh. Raleigh's been here actually before, although I haven't met you then, but still. Raleigh's been here before when applying to grad schools, and currently he's at the University of Notre Dame, and he's going to be talking to us about alphabetic cuneiform and political resistance. The floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. Just closing up here, I wanted to thank Martin and Ali again for putting on this conference so we could get them all. I managed to bookend the conference with two biblicists. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but thank you to all of you. Your papers have been great. Thank you for letting me come in here and pretend to be an Assyriologist for a day, I guess. So just getting started. So the excavation of Ugarit, or modern Ras Shamra, in 1928 presented scholars with a new system of cuneiform script that differed from previous attestations in that it utilized a standardized alphabet rather than the large syllabaries used in Akkadian and Hittite texts. Technologically and stylistically similar, but graphemically independent from Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform, Ugaritic cuneiform was utilized exclusively for texts composed in the Ugaritic language. Previous scholarship has often adopted the view that because the Ugaritic alphabet appears similar to Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform in terms of being recorded via the use of wedges and clay and possesses the same alphabetic order as the Phoenician alphabet, the former must have necessarily slowly evolved from the latter two. The aim of this study is to suggest that the creation and usage of Ugaritic cuneiform to produce texts written in the local vernacular marks a distinct statement of political self-identity by the ruling class of Ugarit in the face of foreign suzerainty. This hypothesis will hopefully be strengthened through an examination of mythical texts from Ugarit and examples of ex nihilo script creation from later time periods. Ugaritic and Akkadian are linguistically related, with Akkadian coming from the eastern branch of the Semitic language family, while Ugaritic, along with Aramaic, Hebrew, and Phoenician, among others, comes from the northwestern branch. In addition to sharing a wide range of morphological features, the technological conventions for communicating via the two different forms of cuneiform overlap. Like traditional syllabic cuneiform, Ugaritic was written by impressing small wedges into clay with a reed stylus, which formed a standardized group of signs. And here we have a really fun text about the establishment and hierarchy of a drinking club in ancient Ugarit called the Marziku. An untrained observer would easily mistake an Ugaritic tablet for one written in Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform, as many of the wedge orientations found in traditional syllabic cuneiform are also found in Ugaritic. In this way, Ugaritic cuneiform was composed in the same mode as syllabic cuneiform. However, Ugaritic cuneiform also represented a dramatic break from Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform that dominated the period. Rather than utilizing a large base of signs that could be used either logographically or syllabically, Ugaritic cuneiform possibly represents the earliest standardized system of alphabetic writing. Further, there is no crossover in sign usage between Ugaritic and Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform, despite Akkadian syllabaries containing nearly 1,000 signs at certain points. The Ugaritic alphabet therefore represents a streamlining of the dominant writing system of the day, while still maintaining the essential character of traditional cuneiform. Syllabic cuneiform writing persisted as the primary writing system in the ancient Near East from its onset until it was slowly displaced by Aramaic during the first millennium BCE. Despite the greater degree of ease provided by employing the Aramaic language in an administrative context, usage of syllabic cuneiform continued to some degree throughout the fall of the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, extending into the Common Era. Usage appears to have remained ubiquitous regardless of the spoken language of the dominant empires of the period. Scribes represented their native languages allographically via syllabic cuneiform throughout the ancient Near East, regardless of regional origin or language family. In the 14th to 13th centuries, the period in which Ugaritic cuneiform is most likely to have arisen, the major powers of the Eastern Mediterranean employed traditional cuneiform for the purposes of diplomatic correspondence. The Hittite Empire communicated with other empires as well as its vassal states in their native language, utilizing a form of syllabic cuneiform that included a smaller syllabary. Approximately dated Akkadian texts found in the archives of the Egyptian city of Amarna isolate an otherwise unique usage of Akkadian and traditional cuneiform in a non-Mesopotamian setting. The Amarna letters demonstrate that Egypt was utilizing Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform for administrative purposes during this period like its neighbors. The irregularity of the Akkadian syntax and morphology found in these letters evidences the degree to which local vernacular was able to influence written communication, even in the case of royal correspondences. Though the various city-states of Canaan spoke in regional vernaculars as well, independent from the language of their suzerains, there were also numerous examples of traditional cuneiform tablets from Middle and Late Bronze Age Canaan. The excavations at Ugarit revealed a large number of Akkadian language tablets with a higher degree of genre diversity than those from other Canaanite cities during the same time period. As Akkadian was the primary written language of the Near East during this period, texts discussing matters which were not uniquely Ugaritic in nature, that is, non-mythological, ritual, or intergovernmental texts, were composed almost exclusively in Akkadian rather than the regional vernacular. Foreign treaties and land grants were composed in Akkadian without exception. Royal correspondences with foreign rulers were similarly written in Akkadian and traditional cuneiform, with only a very small fraction being written in Ugaritic. Over 175 royal legal texts from the palace at Ras Shamra have been published, many written in Akkadian with a smaller number in Ugaritic as well. Though the vocabulary of these texts shows evidence of influence from Canaanite dialects and Hurrian, the language is essentially a form of Middle Babylonian Akkadian, written in Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform. The scribes of Ugarit were sufficiently steeped in the dominant language systems of the day, such that they were able to communicate in multiple vernaculars through the use of traditional cuneiform writing. These texts, composed in the language and writing system of more dominant powers, evidences a city-state on the geographic and political periphery of the empires to which they served as vassals. While the scribes of Ugarit were communicating with the outside world via the dominant languages and script of the period, they were simultaneously composing texts in the local vernacular via an alternative system of alphabetic writing. Though Akkadian texts from Ras Shamra contextualized the role of the city-state in the Near Eastern political sphere of the 14th to 13th centuries, the Ugaritic texts provide a window into the ritual and internal political life of Ugarit during the period. The question remains why the scribes of Ugarit maintained this double identity in terms of the texts that they produced. Despite the Hittites having a mythological and ritual foundation independent from the Mesopotamian world that gave rise to Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform, Hittite scribes still recorded their myths via the use of traditional cuneiform. Such was not the case for Ugarit. As Seth Sanders notes, the divide between the internal use of Ugaritic cuneiform over and against the external use of the system of writing inherited from foreign powers suggests an intentional promulgation for the creation of Ugaritic cuneiform on the part of the state. Ugarit, a subaltern political entity located on the path from one dominant power to another, appears to have instituted its own writing system in an effort to communicate ideas and messages which were uniquely Ugaritic. In order to understand the historical circumstances which led to the creation and institution of alphabetic cuneiform at Ugarit in the 13th century, it's necessary to explore the political context of the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. As a port city located on the crossroads of major regional empires, Ugarit benefited from multiple trade avenues, thereby resulting in economic prosperity for the city. The apparent abilities of Ugaritic scribes to communicate in multiple major languages of the period evidences the city's status as a trade hub servicing much of the ancient Near East. However, despite its economic prosperity, it was comparatively politically unremarkable in comparison to other proximal ports such as the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon. As a peripheral region for dominant political powers, the hinterland surrounding Ugarit was frequently a site for border disputes among local empires. Though it shared cultural and linguistic similarities with its Phoenician neighbors, Ugarit never engaged in a coalition in an effort to push back on foreign incursion from Egypt or Hatti. Instead, extant texts suggest that the city-state of Ugarit was frequently engaged in vassal-client relationships with more dominant powers throughout its history. Egypt's 18th dynasty, the first of the New Kingdom, likely represents the earliest period of direct political reliance on Egypt by Ugarit. Ugarit maintained a positive relationship with Egypt throughout the majority of this period due to the advantages provided by triangular maritime trade between Ugarit, Egypt, and the island of Cyprus. The first king of Ugarit for whom we have substantial records, Amastamri I, pledged fealty to Egypt as late as the mid-14th century, stating in a text from the Amarna letters, "I have fallen 7 times and 7 times at your feet." On a larger scale, this period was broadly defined by frequent conflict between the Egyptians and Hittites, who constantly fought for control of Syria and the northern Levant. By the reign of Niqmadu II, the son of Amastamri, the successful Hittite invasion of the northern Levant resulted in the loss of Ugarit by Egypt, despite their alliance with the Mitanni at the time. Though Ugarit still engaged in maritime trade with Egypt, the city formally fell under the hegemony of the Hittite Empire. Ugarit entered the sphere of Hittite control by their own accord, rather than through military defeat and subsequent subjugation. Facing invasion from a coalition of anti-Hittite neighbors, Niqmadu II appealed to Hittite king Shupiluma for assistance. This request marked the beginning of the suzerain-vassal relationship that would persist until the fall of Ugarit in the early 12th century BCE. These relationships with Egypt and Hatti influenced the cultural and political trajectory of Ugarit through the protection and trade benefits provided by the former. As previously stated, texts composed in a number of different languages and recorded in Sumero-Akkadian and Hittite, among others, were found at Ugarit due to syllabic cuneiform serving as the primary writing system for the major empires of the period. As such, the ruling and scribal classes of 13th century Ugarit benefited from numerous options for composing the mythical texts and internal correspondences for which we now know the city. This begs the question why a cosmopolitan trade hub would suddenly begin to produce texts composed in their own local vernacular and written in an innovative system of cuneiform rather than the standard international language of the period. Because Ugarit fell under the auspices of the Hittite Empire during its period of greatest economic prosperity, one would imagine that internal correspondences and formative national myth would necessarily be written in the dominant writing system of the time, the Hittite language utilizing syllabic cuneiform. Instead, these formative texts were composed in the local vernacular via alphabetic cuneiform. In order to understand this anomaly, we look to the mythical texts composed in Ugarit for potential insights concerning the creation of this writing system. The function of myth in the ancient world has long plagued theorists and historians. Though some characterize myth as little more than an outlet for fanciful storytelling with little basis in the political realia of the ancient world, others believe that myth reflects the distinct ritual practices or political circumstances experienced by those responsible for recording the narratives. Ugarit's mythical texts provide researchers with a unique opportunity to observe the internal ritual and political dialogue of Ugarit without the heightened rhetorical genuflecting that occurs in the communication between a vassal and their suzerain. 3 major mythic texts composed in Ugaritic cuneiform were excavated at Ras Shamra. The epics of Akhat and Kirta, both of which center on human characters and detail their interactions with the gods, and the Baal Cycle, a cosmological narrative devoid of human actors. Though Akhat and Kirta provide modern readers with a detailed view of the Ugaritic pantheon in addition to potential prescriptions for ritual mourning and celebration, it is the Baal Cycle that is of greater importance for the present study. Looking through the lens of Bronislaw Malinowski's assertion that myth is reflective of social realities and history, we will examine whether the Baal Cycle accurately reflects the political position of Ugarit during the period in which alphabetic cuneiform arose. Written on a series of 6 partially broken tablets, the Baal Cycle contains a series of short, seemingly connected narratives which together detail the exploits of the Ugaritic god Baal. As the narrative begins, Baal serves an unspecified role in the court of El, head of the Ugaritic pantheon. Yam, the divine representation of the sea, sends a cohort of messengers to the court demanding that El hand over Baal to Yam so that Yam might obtain the riches of Baal. After a long battle that is interrupted by a break in the text, Baal is victorious over his rival. Following a feast commemorating his victory over Yam, Baal laments to his sister Anat that he lacks a grand palace like those of the other gods. After Anat convinces El to sanction the building of Baal's temple, she delivers the news to him and he rejoices. Following the construction of this temple, Mot, the god of death, seeks to devour Baal in order to quell his appetite. Following the death of Baal at the hands of Mot, he is mourned by his fellow gods. In a broken section of CAT 1.6, column 4, Baal is supposedly discovered and returned to the realm of the living after Mot is killed by Anat. Following his return to the throne, he once again engages in battle with a revivified Mot. When the battle appears to be at a standstill, El intervenes on behalf of Baal, proclaiming that Mot cannot possibly defeat his foe. Through El's recognition of Baal as being victorious over Mot, he is granted a royal seat of power. The narrative arc of the Baal cycle involves a secondary deity facing attacks from his rivals and seeking a royal palace from the head of the pantheon. Gods to whom the text refers to as the beloved of El battle against Baal, and Baal receives no such titles. Multiple scholars have previously suggested that the stories reflect the political circumstances faced by Ugarit in the 14th to 13th centuries BCE. Both Aaron Tugendhoft and Seth Sanders have juxtaposed the politically inflected narrative of the Baal cycle with another text which scholars have argued reflects the political circumstances of the region from which it arose, Enuma Elish. Few would question Marduk's progression from creation at the hands of more esteemed archaic deities for the purpose of their protection to the center of the pantheon was meant to echo the political and military rise of Babylon to supremacy among the former major powers of the Sumerian Empire. In a similar fashion, Baal's status as a deity of secondary order, who was vulnerable to the attacks of rivals and the indifference of his suzerain, El, reflects the international status of Ugarit during the period. The colophon of the Baal cycle states that the recording of the text was commissioned by Niqmadu, either the second or the third, we're not sure. Previously thought to be the same Niqmadu who requested the assistance of the Hittite Empire in the face of foreign invasion. However, scholarly consensus now suggests that the text may not have been written down until a later date due to a lack of attestation of Ugaritic cuneiform during the reign of Niqmadu II, as well as the fact that cuneiform texts most often come from the period shortly prior to the destruction of the city in which they were located. Instead, the narrative was likely recorded in the mid to late 13th century. This attribution brings the compositional date of the Baal cycle in line with chronological estimates for the creation of alphabetic cuneiform. Looking instead to the reign of Amistarmi II provides us with a historical circumstance for both the creation of Ugaritic cuneiform as well as the recording of the Baal cycle. It was during this period that the yoke of Hittite rule became sufficiently burdensome so as to elicit subtle acts of political resistance against foreign rule. As has previously been shown, though Ugarit was an economically prosperous city-state that benefited from the freedoms provided by its vassal status in the Hittite Empire, it was still subjected to military demands and burdensome tributary requirements. In a letter from Hittite King Tudhaliya IV to Amistarmi II, Tudhaliya releases Ugarit from military service in an impending battle with Assyrian forces. However, in this remission of military service, Tudhaliya levied a noticeably higher tributary rate than previously attested. Further, the Hittites later rescinded this remission by demanding a contribution of Ugaritic troops for a battle against the resurging Assyrian Empire. Like Baal, the source of Amistarmi II's power was his suzerain. The source of Amistarmi II's power was his status as a suzerain rather than his own military might. This provisional favor was based solely on his willingness to assist in the progress of the empire. Looking again to Malinowski's assertion that myth is reflective of social and historical realities, there appears to be an admission of secondary political status expressed by the literati of Ugarit in the Baal cycle. The overtly political allusions of the narrative, coupled with the sudden appearance of a new writing system used to convey the local vernacular, illustrates an attempt on the part of the Ugaritic ruling class to assert political self-identity in the face of foreign control. In the same way that the content of the Baal cycle may be viewed as a statement against Hittite suzerainty, so too should the creation of the writing system itself. Because Ugaritic scribes composed texts dealing with the outside world in the standard international writing system of the day, while composing texts unique to Ugarit in a localized vernacular and script, it is no great leap to suggest that this localized script arose through a process of institutional advocacy rather than natural evolution. If Ugaritic cuneiform arose as a result of governmental proclamation, rather than an unspecified process of evolution, this would not be unique in the history of scripts. Old Persian cuneiform appears to have arisen out of a similar push for political self-identity, in contrast to more dominant writing systems. Like the Ugaritic alphabet, Old Persian cuneiform is graphemically independent from other cuneiform systems, save for a single sign used exclusively for non-Persian loanwords. This lack of sign crossover suggests that Old Persian cuneiform was created with more prominent systems of syllabic cuneiform in view, but that it is not entirely dependent on them. The script, which is not attested prior to the Behistun inscription, was used almost exclusively for monumental inscriptions rather than foreign correspondences or literary texts. These inscriptions, often triple inscribed in Old Persian, Elamite, and Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform, detail the military victories and grandeur of Persian kings. Rather than Babylonian alone, which was often used for internal administrative communication, or Aramaic, the primary language for international communication, the Persians created a script to communicate their might in a local vernacular. It is true that the Persian Empire of the 6th century BCE was decidedly more politically and military dominant than 13th century Ugarit. Further, the usage of these two scripts differed. While Ugaritic cuneiform was utilized for the composition of all major textual genres, Old Persian cuneiform is found almost exclusively in large-scale municipal inscriptions. However, the differences present in the historical context for the creation of these two writing systems is one of degree rather than kind. The usage of Old Persian makes clear that the creation of a script could be a politically motivated act intended to be an expression of a distinct self-identity. Based on the historical circumstances surrounding 13th century Ugarit, there are clear contextual parallels suggesting a similar motive and process for the creation of Ugaritic cuneiform. Unfortunately, among the many texts found over the last century from Ras Shamra, excavators have not yet unearthed a declaration by an Ugaritic king commissioning the creation of a new writing system with the intention of recording texts in the local vernacular rather than the dominant language of the empire. To conclusively assert that Ugaritic cuneiform arose as a result of institutional proclamation would require the discovery of such text or a secondary reference to it. However, when attempting to provide a historical reconstruction for an event with no direct primary textual evidence, one must necessarily proceed in their endeavor with a small degree of speculation. What results from the observation of these texts is the picture of a city-state seeking to outgrow the constraints of their suzerain. Though the assertion that Ugaritic cuneiform arose as a means of declaring a distinct political self-identity is admittedly speculative, there's little evidence in support of alternative hypotheses. Texts composed in Ugaritic cuneiform are inherently nationalistic due to the division of Ugaritic literature from the world at large. There is no royal decree advocating for the creation of a vernacular script. It is the mythical, methodological, and economic texts, among others, which serve in its stead. Thank you.
All right. Are there any questions or comments for Federico?
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. So you touched on very big topics like origin and choice of writing systems, multilingualism, and I think those are questions that have never been addressed satisfactorily in the Levant, and we should start, those of us who work on in the Levant, we should start addressing those questions from sociolinguistic point of views. And in my research, I've noticed I was always struck by different types of Akkadian depending on different sites. So you have text from Kumidi, which I showed to you this morning, that are in a very similar form of Canaano-Akkadian as the Amarna letters. Then I looked at the very few texts from Kadesh, and they are in pretty standard and pristine Middle Babylonian. And then I worked on the text from the Archive of Idada from Katna, and I don't have any Hurrian, any knowledge of Hurrian, and the letters, the diplomatic letters, are basically incomprehensible and inaccessible if you don't have Hurrian. So I had to rely on translations from Hurrian specialists. And at Katna, you see that the letters have a lot of Hurrian vocabulary and morphology. The administrative texts don't have very little Hurrian, and very little Hurrian influences. And it seems like there is a linguistic choice, a choice in the use of Hurrian vocabulary between the different types of text. Then you have a case like Byblos, and cuneiform at Byblos seems to be very limited, and only 2 cuneiform tablets have been found from Byblos. One is Old Babylonian and one is New Assyrian, and they're rather unremarkable. But Rib Hadda was communicating in cuneiform with the Egyptians. But by contrast, we know that there's plenty of Egyptian inscriptions at Byblos, and maybe there were even local people at Byblos who were capable of reading and writing Egyptians. And it seems that Ugarit obviously is the best case study because of the wealth of textual material and the wealth of languages, writing systems, and probably even writing media. But I think like those questions can be addressed and should be addressed all over the Levant, because these cases, the cases you described of different choices in language and writing system, are pretty much at every site in the Levant from where we have substantial textual corpora.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely a super interesting issue. Seth Sanders is doing some super interesting work on this. If nobody's read his book, Invention of Hebrew, like run, do not walk. Go get it and read it because he discusses this issue at length. And I think that the idea of approaching languages from an allographic perspective, like the use of alternative writing systems for non-standard languages, is a really interesting question. Like, why are we doing this? I mean, when we look at, this is really late for all of us, but when we look at like the 6th to 8th century texts that come from along like the Silk Road, we see Chinese being written in Arabic script. Like, why are things like this happening? And kind of bringing that back to the time period that we study, I think is an interesting question. Thank you.
On that note, it would also be worth checking out his newer book, From Oedipus to Enoch.
Check it all out.
Yeah, if it sets
Smart.
years, you should probably read it. At least for what I do.
Thank you.
I'm going to change my name to Seth Sanders now. All right. Any other questions or comments, sir? Oh, please do.
Can I just say it's very impressive to give such an engaging presentation right at the end of the day.
Thank you. That is a huge
All right, well, if there are no further questions. We're making good time in the sense that we are ahead of time even. We finished early, which is, I think, unusual for a conference. So also, congratulations to you all. Just to sort of close off with a few finishing remarks. So Ali and I have been putting this together as a conference that started at Brown 4 years ago now, if I'm not mistaken. This is the 3rd iteration of it. The idea has always been to sort of pass on the torch to someone else. So if any other institution, like, I don't know, Harvard or Yale or Johns Hopkins, just to name a few, would like to take that torch, then please do. Because I think, and I don't know, I'm guessing you all here have enjoyed to hear today's talks and to hear other people's work, whether it's in your field or not. I think as Alex pointed out this morning, it is, I find it peculiar that there is quite a bit of overlap. Whether you're talking about, very sort of localized, patterns and constructions in philology and in text, and not to put like a structuralist tone to it, but for material culture we have the same problem, right? You see very specific, localized things. How do you access the sort of dimensions of that just through the methods that we have? So I think there's a lot to be gained and learned from sharing these perspectives, and I think there's a lot to be gained and learned from these kind of low-key events where it's possible to just discuss it and not have any pressure from outside, even though it is broadcast and we do get questions from the outside world and we enjoy it. But it's also very nice to just sort of not have the pressure of, I don't know, Professor Ugarit sitting in the audience. Hey, what are you doing? So in that sense, I think it was a very big success today. And I thank you all, and Ali also.